no doubt a big crowd will form. Ladies and gentlemen, Marty is the founder and CEO at ChargeFox, Australia's largest open ultra-rapid network of EV charging stations. By the end of the year, ChargeFox will have connected Adelaide to Brisbane for EV drivers, with additional stations in Tasmania and Western Australia. Prior to ChargeFox, Marty was the founder and CEO at Cogent, a software business in Melbourne. Since 2007, Cogent has been an ongoing successful experiment in running an open values-driven business. They use skills in strategy, design and development to help customers build useful products. In his younger days, Marty spent a lot of time in dingy pool halls around the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, but today he's here to share the bright present and the charged future. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marty Andrews from ChargeFox.
Thanks, John. I didn't know I was getting the dingy pool hall talk today. Thank you.
It's on your LinkedIn profile, mate, not mine.
Right, yes it is. All right, I'm going to come down today and engage with the crowd a little bit more. So, g'day everyone. I'm Marty. I run ChargeFox, Australia's largest EV charging network. There's some links up here if you want to rant at me on Twitter or Facebook, or at the company on Twitter and Facebook and ask me questions like, when's the next charger opening? Lots of people like asking that. That's where you can find me. Happy to chat there. So here's a bit of a picture of ChargeFox. We've been running a charging network in Australia for over 2 years now. And you can see on the map, we've got chargers all over the country, a bunch of chargers all over New Zealand, 2 in the US. I'm not going to talk about them today. But in that time, we've processed over 50,000 charging sessions. More than 50,000 times people have gone and used a charger using the ChargeFox app. And over that journey, we've learnt a lot about how people use charging. How do Australians use charging? Let's not hypothesise about what happens in Europe and America. Let's learn about what happens in our local market. So I'm starting to share some of the story about that at events like this to help people who are interested in buying cars to understand what people do, who are in the industry to understand how they can change what they want to do to influence the market and bring the entire industry forward. So this is a bit of a journey about that. Now, when we began the business, we worked very closely with a lot of the car manufacturers. And there are 3 problems that people have when they walk into a dealership and they look at an electric car. Number 1 is price. There's not much I can do about that, but they're here today and the prices are coming way down than what they were 2 years ago, so that's going to be a bit of a trend as well. Number 2 is range. People were worried about how far my cars could go. So again, the range on those cars is getting bigger, the batteries are getting bigger, they're going further distances. So that's helping itself as well. But number 3 was infrastructure. People would walk into a dealership. I'm from Melbourne. They would walk into a dealership and they would say, hey, this is a great car, but what if I want to drive from Melbourne to Sydney? And the answer at the time was, and there are some early adopters I realise in this crowd that would do this the hard way, but for most people, there were no chargers that were kind of relevant. So the answer from the dealers was, well, you really kind of can't. And at that point, people would turn out and walk away from the dealership. So we worked really closely with all of those companies to try and figure out how to solve that problem and pulled together a project that began about a year ago where we raised a significant amount of cash from ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, from the Victorian Government and private investment. And together we put together a project to spend about $15.5 million on building highway infrastructure to allow you to drive those long distances, to connect Adelaide to Melbourne, up to Sydney and Brisbane, a little bit over in WA, a little bit down in Tassie. So that when people walked into the dealership and looked at those cars and said, what if I want to drive to Melbourne to Sydney? The dealers could say, well, you can. Now, I'm from Melbourne, and guess what I did this week? I drove my EV from Melbourne to Sydney. That's it in the stand over there. And only a few days ago, it was back in Melbourne. So I started in Euroa. That first picture top left is in Euroa. And then I went to Barnawartha North, which is just near Albury-Wodonga. The next one's Horsbrook, then Juggiong, then Mittagong, and then I was here. Now, I didn't have to stop that many times, but I'm a charger nerd, so I wanted to check them all out on the way. I probably would have had to stop about 3 times along the way. And I got here just fine. And I'm going to do that whole trip in reverse starting tonight as well. So I want to show you a little bit about what some of those stations look like so you can get a feel for those charges when you get on the road. But before I dive into that, this is just a picture of how fast our network has been growing over time. So this is about 2 years ago, October 2017, the first charges appeared on the ChargeFox network. And here we are 2 years later with over 1,000 plugs under management. Now, one of the surprising things for me is that big red section down the bottom. That big red section are fleet or private plugs. If you download the ChargeFox app and look at the pins on the map, you don't see any of them. They are businesses who are putting them out the back for their fleet vehicles, or sometimes private residences who are trying to understand their energy usage. So lots and lots of private plugs. Some of those are private because we've installed them and not made them public yet, but they will become public. So we do get a lot of kind of transition. But I'm personally surprised 2 years in about how much of that is private. And I think it's a really strong sign that fleet buyers in particular are starting to pick up electric cars. But the top three layers, the big blue one is AC chargers. They're the kind of lower powered chargers, but they're at the shops, they're at the movies, they're at the vineyards, they're at places where you go and stop for an hour or two and you can plug in your car and get top-up charges. I'm going to talk more about top-up charging as we go. The green bit is fast chargers. They're all DC chargers, typically 50 kilowatts. And a good example of that is the Queensland Electric Superhighway. So Energy Queensland put in about 17 sites from Brisbane all the way up to Cairns. So there's DC chargers all along the way. So you can do a nice road trip up the coast of Queensland. And the little black bit at the top is the ultra rapid chargers. And that's that project that I was talking about, the ChargeFox engaged to build those really fast chargers on the highways to connect the cities. And this is what they look like. So this is the first photo that I had on my trip. This is at Euroa in Victoria. If you start in Melbourne and go north on the highway, you get about 170 k's up the road and you get to Euroa. It's the first time on the road trip where my kids in the back seat are yelling at me they need to stop and go to the bathroom and they're hungry and they need to get out of the car. So it's a good kind of spot. And this is in a big roadside service centre. There is a petrol station, but there's also a McDonald's, there's a couple of cafes, there's bathrooms. So the charging stations aren't near the petrol station, they're in the car park next to the cafes. The two stations you can see on the left there are capable of charging up to 350 kilowatts. That's a lot of power. That's a medium-sized apartment building kind of power that can get into your car. The two on the right are 50 kilowatt DC charging stations. There are CCS2 plugs and CHAdeMO plugs, which is pretty much any car you can buy on the market today. What you can see in the background in these big boxes here are some of the switchboards and some of the gear for the chargers, but also a battery that is over 400 kilowatt hours. And off the screen to the left is 150 kilowatts of solar panels as well. So we use the solar to charge the batteries, we use the batteries to charge the cars, right? And even with all of that infrastructure, we still do connect to the grid. This is critical infrastructure. We don't ever want to leave anyone stranded. Our contracts with the energy companies are always 100% green power. Every one of these sites is completely powered by renewable energy. So that's what one of those looks like. Next stop up the road is Barnawartha North. That is just outside Albury-Wodonga. Pardon me? Nice parking. Nice parking, yeah. I was posing for the photo that day, sorry. Similar kind of setup. So 250 kilowatt DC chargers, two chargers capable of 350 kilowatts. You can see some shops in the background where you can go and grab a snack. You can see a little shelter in the background with a picnic table there. And this is what's on the ground next to it. That's 100 kilowatts of ground mount solar. So again, that whole renewable story, powering these chargers by renewable energy. This one's in Brisbane. Anyone from Queensland in the room? No Queenslanders. Okay. I won't spend too much time on this. This is in a shopping centre, so they end up in different kind of spots. Again, you can kind of just see the difference. The two on the right are 350 kilowatt chargers. The one on the left is a 50 kilowatt charger. This one's in Melbourne at a place called Westfield Airport West. This is the most powerful charging site in the southern hemisphere. There are 4 350 kilowatt charging stations and 2 50 kilowatt charging stations. That's 1.5 megawatts of power for anyone who's doing the math in their head. That is a shitload. And this one's in Torquay. This is number 1 Great Ocean Road. This is the RACV resort. So this is part of the backing of the Victorian government was to unlock some tourism routes. This is a classic driving route in Victoria, going to drive along the Great Ocean Road. Nice charging site there. And there's a heap under construction. We actually have 6 more sites under construction. Here's 4 of them. For any locals, there's a bunch of New South Wales sites there on that list. And all of those sites actually have chargers installed right now, and they will be opening very, very soon. I won't say specifically when, but if you want to keep an eye on it, then you can go and subscribe to the mailing list on the website or follow us on social media. You'll see announcements of those things very soon. That's part of that connection for the long-distance road travel. So there you go. That's an example of what the ultra-rapid sites are that we manage. But I also want to share some stories today about how do people charge. And this is the things that we've learnt from 50,000 charging sessions being processed on our network. And here's one of the things. So a question we ask is, when do people charge? And the answer to that seems to be about the middle of the day. So it's a very kind of normal shaped curve. You can see it's kind of midnight at one end through to midnight at the other end. So not much is happening really early in the morning and not much is happening really late at night. Most charging is happening in the middle of the day. But I'm going to split that apart too, because remember I had the yellowy bits at the top are all those fleet private chargers. So I'm going to try and decouple what do fleet chargers do from what do public charging do. So public charging, this is just the public part of the graph, is a little bit different. There's some charging happening first thing in the morning. So this first peak is the 9 a.m. peak. So people are plugging in between 9 a.m. to 9:15. Then it tails off a little bit and it comes back up at lunchtime. There's another time later on when people plug in at lunchtime, and it kind of tails off to the end of the day. The private chargers are just varied. And part of this is just because they're all sorts of different businesses, so we're still kind of learning about how they work. Some of these are companies where they've bought some EVs that they allocate to staff. They might be salespeople who go and do sales calls, so those staff members have them allocated to them. Some of them might be councils where they've bought a little pool of cars that they get shared amongst the staff. So they're kind of sitting there, and if someone needs to duck off to a meeting that's half an hour away, they can take one of those cars. So they get kind of varied stuff. And some of it's domestic charging as well. So people are at home plugging in their garages. So still learning a little bit about the private charging is the answer there. Okay, the next question we ask is, how long do people charge? How long do they stay plugged in for? So this graph, like the very first column is 0 to 15 minutes, then it's 15 minutes to 30 minutes, and so on across the graph. And the answer is people plug in for about an hour. Now, if you take those 2 bits of data together, when do they charge? Middle of the day. How long do they charge? About an hour. Guess what? People go for lunch, they plug in, they go and have their lunch, they come back, they unplug, they get on their way. Surprise, surprise. So this kind of tails off pretty wildly. The big spike on the far right-hand side, remember that yellowy colour is the fleet and private buyers. That is literally people who plug in at home and go on holidays for a week. And they just leave their cars in there. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. Like we talk a lot about at ChargeFox about what we could do to support the grid and the energy companies. And if cars are plugged in for a week, you can do some really interesting things with them. So we're thinking about that as well. So about an hour, middle of the day. This is really just to give you a sense of how fast the growth is happening. So that is the number of charging sessions we process every day. I say 200 plus. We're probably actually doing about 250 a day now, so it's kind of growing exponentially. There are almost certainly 50 people plugged in on a ChargeFox charger right now, somewhere on the network. And given that we're in about the middle of the day, it's probably actually about 70 or 80. So growing. When you add all the numbers together, It's a couple of megawatt hours of energy every day that they're processing through the chargers. And you can see that the shape of this graph is starting to tick up exponentially. So what that really kind of means is you'll see in the news and the media, people are talking about, well, what happens when all these electric cars are on? How's the grid going to cope? So when we get this thing growing really, really quickly and the megawatt hours goes from 2 to 10 to 50 to 100 megawatt hours, then we got to start to do really interesting things in actually supporting the grid and making it better rather than having it die away. Now this is the last graph, and this is probably the most surprising one to me. And the most surprising one to people that talk to me. The most common question that I get asked by far, people come up to me and say, Marty, how long does it take to charge an EV? It is absolutely the wrong question to ask, but I'm surprised about how wrong it is. And the reason it's the wrong question to ask is because people who ask that question are people that drive petrol cars, and they are used to driving their petrol cars until they get below the quarter of a tank, or maybe until the little light comes on, and then they go to the petrol station and they fill it all the way back up again. People who drive EVs do not charge their cars the same way that petrol drivers fill their petrol tanks. They do little top-ups. So the average here in terms of charging is less than 10 kilowatt hours. So the batteries in all the cars out there are kind of 40 to 90 kilowatt hours. So they are doing somewhere between an eighth to a tenth of the battery capacity. They're doing little top-ups all the time. It's a bit more like your mobile phone. Lots of people come home every night, plug in their mobile phone, regardless of how flat it is, just so it's ready the next day. EV drivers often charge at home, and they charge 2 or 3 times a week just because it's convenient to, so they don't wait for it to be flat. Now I'm going to say this a different way. From about the middle of this graph all the way across to the other side is what I would call the fill-up zone. That's where people are actually running it down to empty and then filling it all the way back up again. In 50,000 charging sessions, that is less than 1% of the sessions that we process. Now, I thought it was going to be low, but I'm surprised that is that low. And this is really interesting for us in the industry because it changes the way we think about the infrastructure that people need. Okay? You don't necessarily need super high-powered chargers everywhere to do empty to full. There are some cases where you do. Long road trips are one. If you're in apartment charging where you don't necessarily have infrastructure in your basement or you don't have any car parking at all, maybe you need some of that. But people do not charge their car that way. So there's some kind of interesting things to learn out of that. So I think that's it from me today. I'm just trying to share the stories about how people do this stuff. I want you, if you're in the market thinking about an EV and kicking the tyres today, be reassured that the infrastructure is rolling out. We add new plugs to our network every single week, and that number is growing. The ultra-rapid network is well under construction, and they'll be open shortly. And the habits of people mean that you'll get really well supported by all of the parts of the industry here today. Again, if you want to chase me down, you can get me on social media and through our website there. John, have we got time for questions?
We'll do one or two because we have this. You can all hear me? Any real good questions that everyone else in the room will want to know? I'll take the microphone to him for you. Thank you. See you at the podium. Yep. Genuine questions only because time is fleeting.
Yes, good afternoon, Marty. It's Ross again. And just for
Nice and close, Ross, to your mouth, please.
just for those who are here who haven't spoken to you previously, the cost per kilowatt hour that you charge from your chargers, please.
Yeah, so the question was, what's the cost per kilowatt hour? So it varies widely across the network. I'll say, so ChargeFox is building the ultra-rapid charging stations. Most of our network is owned by third parties and we're the operator of the network. The rule of thumb on the network is the person that owns the charging station sets the price. So they range from free. There are a bunch of charging stations that are free. Often at the shops, people want you to come and spend money in their shops, so we'll put charging stations in and make them free. If there is a price, It ranges from about 20 cents to 45 cents a kilowatt hour, which I'll say is way, way cheaper than petrol.
You said that the average session was 1 hour and 10 kilowatts. Is that still possibly part of range anxiety?
Now, I have a bit of saying that the only people with range anxiety are people that don't drive electric vehicles. I think it's really normal when you drive an electric car just to plug in when it's convenient. Filling petrol vehicles is inherently inconvenient. You have to go somewhere that you don't want to go to do that. But EV drivers just top up really regularly at home and at places where they go because it's convenient to. So those little sessions aren't because they're worried about getting flat. They're probably going from kind of 50 to 80%, so they're not even getting down to the bottom of their battery.
Yeah, just one quick last question that's actually eating into my talk time now that I realise. Do you think we're going to see a titration down of vehicle battery sizes? Once people realise they don't need 90 kilowatt hours, they can settle for 40. Do you think we're going to see a shift towards smaller batteries?
Do I think the battery sizes will get small? I don't think it's about the size of the battery. I think it's about the range of the car. So certainly the cars are getting more efficient. I reckon, personally, there are cars on the market now that are 450 to 500 kilometres range. At that point, range is not it's the same as a petrol vehicle, right? And as there's more and more infrastructure getting out there, there's no argument about range anymore in my mind. I think it just becomes a no-brainer.
Research shows in Australia the average trip is 38 kilometres, and everybody wants an EV that does 4,000 kilometres. Ladies and gentlemen, a big hand, please, for our awesome sponsor and speaker, Marty Andrews. Thank you, Marty. Our next speaker is so famous they wrote a song about him. You might have heard of it, you know.
Dr. Jones, Jones calling, Dr. Jones. Yep, that's why I'm a speaker and not a singer. But you get given a speaker's bio and you think, oh, that looks interesting. So with Chris, I'm not going to do that because, A, I've known him for a few years, and today I discovered he's been the Vice President, the Branch Chairman and the National Secretary, with a typo, of the Australian Electric Vehicle Association for 9 years. He studied at the University of New England and he's got a BSc in Organic Chemistry, the University of Western Australia, graduate diploma. And then the interesting stuff started. PhD in Plant Biochemistry, Project Manager for eStation, Research Chemist, the Australian co-founder of Voltron Motorcycles, and then now with Caper Brevard Technologies. But he also worked on the vertical lift, yeah? I can't wait. It's in your profile, mate. I know you've done too many things when you can't remember. Please welcome Christopher Jones, or Dr. Jones, Professor Jones. You going to be all right with this, or do you want the handheld?
Jump onto my talk. I'll jump down there if I can.
Yeah.
Sure, I saw the vertical lifting on there today.
Oh, the flying machine.
Yeah, the flying machine. Have you got that in commercial production yet?
No.
Come on, hurry up.
Thanks. That's up and ready to go? Oh, good. Okay. Thanks for that. So, yeah, in my job at Cape Brevard Technologies, my official title is battery engineer, but I'm not an engineer. I'm a chemist and a plant genetics guy. But I've built a few batteries in my time, and since taking on this role, I've learnt an awful lot about batteries, how they work, the chemistry behind them. And so for this talk, that we often get asked, yeah, but are electric cars really good for the environment? And there's a lot of interesting science that goes behind determining how good something is for the environment. And so I say, define better. Some of you may have seen this cartoon before, I don't know, but basically someone's complaining that, you know, people aren't being paid enough for manufacturing iPhones, and they post this on social media, and some troll pokes up and says, yeah, well, you did that on an iPhone, you know. And I think the one down here is really quite pertinent. You know, this peasant saying we should really improve society. And he's like, well, but yet you're participating in society. How curious. And basically, in order to make the place better, you need to be part of the society that you want to make better. The best analogy I've heard was the person who invented the internal combustion engine probably rode to work on a horse. The person who developed the light bulb probably worked by candlelight. You work with what you've got until you come up with something better. So, just make sure I've got that right. Basically, modern life is bad for the environment. If you start doing carbon footprints and life cycle analyses of just about everything we do in modern life, it all starts to get quite depressing. Yet we're living longer and eating better food and living better lives than ever before. So something's working out. But basically everything we do, including what we currently do, takes energy and resources and generates emissions. Water, land, emissions, labour, all of that stuff is what provides the life that we enjoy, certainly here in the wealthy Western world. So nothing is free. And what was quite interesting is when Greta Thunberg said, we really need to do something about emissions, and not flying is a good start, everyone said, well, how are you going to go and get your message out? You're going to go full Al Gore and fly everywhere? And she says, no, I'm going to sail across. And some troll said, what's the carbon footprint of that sailboat? I mean, they clearly didn't actually care what the carbon footprint of the sailboat was. They're just trolls. When it comes to EVs, what goes into an EV? Pretty much the same stuff that goes into an internal combustion engine vehicle. A little bit more copper, a little bit more rare earth metals that go into the magnets of the rotor. But by and large, it's a whole bunch of metal and glass and rubber and petrochemicals. It's all pretty much the same, except, of course, the lithium-ion battery. And it is the lithium-ion battery that has the greatest emissions and energy input in the manufacture of an EV. So, we'll say it up front. The manufacturer of an EV typically has 50% more emissions associated with its manufacture than that of an internal combustion engine vehicle. And almost all of that is from the battery. Now, the good news is that once it's made, in operation, it uses a fraction of the emissions. And it takes, depending on how far you drive, a few years to break even. But let's not shy away from the fact that a whole bunch of emissions are generated in the manufacture of an EV and its battery.